Hello, is this thing on? I'm not really good at this whole internet thing. My generation was keener on face-to-face interactions, not stuff like this. After years of therapy though, my doctor thinks that maybe this is just the thing I need. My name is Robert Mason, and I have the worst case of siderodromophobia my psychologist has ever seen. I'm sorry, but I can't help but feel this is all pointless. Most likely there is nothing any of you can say to make me feel any better. I'll never ride the subway again. What happened to me all those years ago? It had to have been a one-in-a-million experience. I've never seen or heard anything like it since then. Nothing in the newspaper, nothing on TV. If anyone has even come close to experiencing the same thing, they've been just as spooked as I was, as I still am some nights when the nightmares blur with reality. It was New York in the 1980s, the era, or bright clothes and poofy hair. I was just a fresh-faced youth with some not-so-fresh acne and sporting a mullet that would have Andre Agassi in tears. Back in the day, the subway may not have been the greatest place to be, but if you kept your wits about you, you'd most likely be alright. It got me from home to school to work and back again. My folks weren't really thrilled with the idea of me riding the subway because, well, as I explained, it was never really the best place to be, especially back then. The graffiti-stained tunnels, the homeless living and defecating down there, not to mention the drug use. Being the hothead that I was though, none of that mattered to me. Nothing could scare me. Besides, my dad was a factory worker and my mom worked 18-hour-plus days as a nurse, and they still just barely cleared 20 grand a year. A car was just out of the question. In what I now look back at as a sad attempt to make myself feel higher up on the social ladder, I like to pretend that the subway was my own personal limousine, complete with my very own driver and everything, just a lot smellier and about as dirty and disrespected as a public restroom. One Saturday evening I'll never forget, I was exhausted as hell. A good buddy of mine had called in sick, so I had to come into work on my day off and cover for them. The car I was in was particularly packed, and there was a guy who had these insanely long fingernails. I can remember feeling sick as I watched him gnaw at his fingernails like some tasty bedtime snack. I'd like to pretend that was dirt underneath them, but God only knows what it really was. Gross as it was, I sat back in my seat and tried my best to ignore it, and maybe get in a catnap until my stop came up. About 20 minutes went by, and finally, the man decided to take a break from his late-night fingernail feast and sit right next to me of all places. Either he hadn't bathed in a week or he had freshly crapped in his pants. I'm not sure which of the two thoughts made me feel any better. Now let me just take a moment to get this out of the way right now. I'm not a bigoted or racist kind of guy or whatever you want to call it. I could care less what color or creed you are, it doesn't make any kind of difference to me whatsoever. That being said, I was never exactly the first person at church, when I actually went, to extend my hand and offer blessings of peace. I don't particularly care to shake hands with someone who probably didn't even wash them, and religion just never was my style, and there was absolutely no way some strange subway guy was gonna magically convert me within the span of a few stops. Alright, look here guy. I sighed, my inner smartass about to re-emerge. I'm Jewish, now I don't know if you heard the bad news, but he's not exactly on speaking terms with my people. So why don't you do yourself a favor and find somebody else to talk to, okay? Suddenly my face grew numb and I was seeing stars. That son of a bitch smacked me dead square across the face. Looking back, I more than likely deserved it, but at the moment, boy, I was pissed off. The next thing I knew, he had his hands wrapped around my neck. "You heathen!" the man shouted. "You dare come into my sanctuary and mock the good Lord! Blasphemy!" If I didn't think this guy had a few screws loose to begin with, what he did next pretty much confirmed my suspicions. Again, I'm no expert, but I'm positive he was quoting scripture that didn't even exist. Boy, ain't you ever heard Psalm 734, 777, and the good Lord said, "Let he who believes ride on this here train to salvation, and may he look out the windows and remind all those on the tracks below him that they have rejected salvation and embraced ignorance." His hands getting tighter around my neck, I clamored as best I could. "Get off me, you crazy fuck!" I had managed to get my hand into my pants pocket and was so close to retrieving my pocket knife. If some of the other people inside the car with us had waited maybe a millisecond or so longer, I would have perhaps been another statistic, one of the 250 or so crimes committed on the subway every week during that time. It would have been so easy to just plunge the knife right into his neck and watch him gasp for air as it slowly filled my lungs with relief. I carried it with me for just a situation such as this. If only I could have, perhaps everything would have transpired differently. The cops would have shown up and I'd have been pulled out of the car right then and there, but life had other plans for me. Some good Samaritans wrestled the freak off me, shoved him out onto the station as we arrived at the next stop. They formed a phalanx around me to make sure that he wasn't getting near me again if he decided to try and reboard. He made no such attempt though. As the doors closed on him, he flattened his hands and face up against the window, giving me the coldest, most emotionless stare I had ever seen before. It is etched into my memory to this day. "You!" He looked undoubtedly deranged as he squawked at me. "Find your inner peace, for you die tonight." The revulsion in his words rattled me to my core. The subway started up again and began to pull away. The crazy bastard tried his best to keep up and started yelling about how people like me were a menace to the world that must be exterminated. Once we got far enough from the station, he must have given up on his crusade against me because his screams grew smaller and faded into an unpleasant memory. When it was certain the danger had passed, a couple of people who had come to my aid gave me their full and undivided attention. It took what felt like an eternity to finally convince them that I'd be all right. I had assured them that as soon as I made it to my stop that I would report the incident. What a lie that was though. I wouldn't have been surprised if my pants went up in flames right there on the spot. I couldn't breathe a word of this to anyone. In the naivete of my youth, I believed that would bring about the end of my existence. If my parents heard that I got into a fight on the subway, they'd insist I stop taking it. I'd never be allowed out of their sight again, and I'd be the only one being driven to college by his mommy. I had a reputation to uphold. At least this was before the days of social media and cell phones that could warp information light years away with the click of a button. I got up and headed toward the back of the car where it seemed to be a little less crowded to take a moment to collect myself. My hysterical heart rate slowly calmed as I leaned back and caught my breath. That was probably the biggest confrontation I had gotten into since middle school. As peace began to flood over me, I noticed that there was one small tender spot on my arm that wasn't going away. Pulling back on my sleeve, I noticed an almost trivial trace of blood that I was sure had not been there before. It almost looked like I was poked or prodded with something, so I figured I must have done it to myself while I was trying to retrieve my pocket knife. As I cleaned the blood, my arms began to grow heavy and weak. This miraculous newfound serenity of mine was quickly turning into a siesta. Everything around me began to go blurry. The last thing I remember is vaguely piecing together some muddled conversations of the other passengers before everything finally went dark. I can't even begin to guess how much time would pass before I would open my eyes again. It's just a good thing I woke back up when I did, otherwise I might not be here relaying this story. A substantial amount of sleep followed by an uncertain amount of time, and the muddled conversations were entering my ears again as I awoke. I was in what could only be described as a state of sleep paralysis. Things were slowly making sense again, but it took every ounce of strength I had to just wiggle my toes. I couldn't open my eyes yet, but if I had to guess there were at least 2 guys in the immediate area. "Hurry, he's waking up!" the first voice alerted. "Already! You said the shit would last longer!" A third voice entered the conversation. "Now settle down, boys, this is not ideal, for him anyway, but at least we've got him right where we need him." That voice sent shivers down my paralyzed spine. I pried my eyes open and took a second to adjust to my surroundings. We weren't in the subway car anymore. No, this was different. This was somewhere in the tunnel. Standing above me was that crazy bastard I fought with earlier. There was some kind of reddish substance smeared all over his face in crazy symbols. A few that I could actually make out appeared to be pentagrams or something of that nature. The feeling in my neck began to come back. I slowly jerked it around to try and make out more of my surroundings. I was right. This guy had 2 other people with him. They were all huddled around me in a circle. The trio looked almost identical, all completely bald and draped in black robes. The one from earlier that I fought with seemed to be their leader. He huddled over me like a dark storm cloud. All I could do was peer into his black, bleak eyes as he stared into mine. If his objective was to get me to pray, he succeeded. I would have given any to be anywhere else in the world. "I'm sorry about this, young man." The leader fraudulently apologized. "You weren't supposed to feel any of this, but what's a little pain in sacrifice to the good Lord?" "Please," I begged, "you don't have to do this." "But we do," he responded. "Through the consumption of contaminated flesh and blood, you shall be made pure again, made whole." He withdrew a rusty knife from within his robe and began to tear away at my shirt, ripping an X in my clothes right by my heart. By this point I was starting to get feeling back in the rest of my body again, but I need a little bit more time. Since I could now talk a little better, I began running my mouth as fast as I could, anything to keep him occupied. "Come on, man, please, I'm sorry about earlier, just let me go. Nothing has happened yet. Let's just forget this whole thing." "You've seen the inside of our sanctuary. I couldn't possibly let you go now," he responded. come on," I begged. "I'll give you all my money." "Bribery? How dare you?" one of the man's followers shouted. I tried to spin it any other way I could. "No, not bribery. Call it a gift. Think of it as a donation to your sanctuary and your cause." "Oh, ha ha ha," the leader devilishly chuckled. "You're already giving the greatest donation of all, your body and blood." He raised the rusty knife high into the air. Suddenly the feeling started to come back in my arms and legs. I could feel the weight of my wallet, and my pocket knife still in my jeans. The crazy bastards must have never even thought about trying to rob me in the first place. Well, thank God they never thought to check for a weapon. As the feeling entered my body more and more, I began gingerly inching my hand towards my pocket. Perhaps in the darkened tunnel they wouldn't notice. "Well," I said, "if this is how it's gotta be, may a condemned man at least be granted some final words?" "Say your piece, young man." The leader nodded his head. "Might I suggest a Hail Mary?" I could feel my pocket knife slithering out of my jeans and into my hand. "Have you heard the good news?" I began to whisper, slowly descending into a roar. "Make peace with your God. You're the one dying tonight." I jumped up as quick as I could and tackled the leader, plunging my pocket knife into his neck. To this day, I'm still not exactly sure how I escaped the grasps of the other guys. Maybe it was divine intervention after all. Down the tunnel in the distance, I could see a subway car stopped. I began my mad dash towards it, not even bothering to look back. All that mattered was getting out of there. "Careful! Don't damage him!" The leader's blood-curdled screams echoed down the tunnel. No sooner than I jumped into the subway car was the door closing behind me. I leaned over to catch my breath for a second, and I could hear the trio banging on the door, eager to tear through it and mutilate me. When I looked back up, I realized something. This car was empty. Where was everyone? For a second I thought maybe I had wandered onto an abandoned line, or perhaps maybe one that was undergoing repairs or something of that nature. After searching the car up and down, I happened to notice there actually was one other person around. He was hunched over in a seat at the opposite end. One of his legs was stretched out across the seats. He was so engrossed in his foot that he didn't seem to even notice I was there. "Hello, sir, can you hear me?" I began to inch my way closer towards him. "I need some help, I'm under attack." Still no response. The guy clearly lived around these parts. He had the tattered clothes to prove it. Long graying hair covered the front of his face, hiding any discernible features. I was maybe 2 or 3 seats away when I could clearly see what he was up to. One of his shoes was off. Not that the dirty, eviscerated pair was doing him any good anyway, and his sock was rolled all the way down past his foot. I stared in horror as I watched him peel off dead, almost rotting flesh off his feet. His foot oozed blood and had something poking through it, which I can only assume were parts of his bone, which he was gnawing at profusely. The banging on the door started up again. One of the attackers on the outside began to holler, "Cyrus, you in there, boy? You there? Go on, get him!" He stopped chomping away at his foot and looked up at me, one eye peering through his lengthy hair. "Oh shit," I muttered to myself. I took off and headed into the next car as quick as I could. Now I had this crazy feral guy on my ass and his foot didn't seem to be a hindrance to him. My lungs burned with red-hot intensity as I tried my best to keep my distance between me and him. If there was any chance of me getting out of this now, I needed to get to the center of train to the conductor's area. It was my only hope of getting off the train and perhaps onto a station platform. Before I knew what even happened, I tripped while in mid-run and banged my head against one of the seats, allowing crazy foot guy to catch up to me. I was so dizzy and confused that I just started kicking and hoped for the best. I thought I was done for when he let out a monstrous howl that sounded almost more wolf than human. Almost immediately afterwards there was dead silence. Not even a peep from a mouse or any other rodent I'm sure inhabited this train. Just like that, he was gone. Maybe I hit him on a soft spot on his foot when I was kicking away. I got up and looked around. My eye was throbbing from where I had fallen, and I could already tell it was going to swell up like a balloon. My heart was beating faster than it had before, but I tried my best to remain cool and collected. About a minute or so later, I made it into the conductor's car. I had a throbbing headache and at this point didn't give a crap about anything at this point. I pushed every button and pulled every lever I could see and hoped for the best. A loud, thunderous moan began to conquer the silence as the doors slowly opened up. I'm not sure what station I was at exactly, but I could tell this one hadn't been actively used in a while, for whatever reason. I began to step onto the platform when an uncomfortable thought completely overtook me and froze me in my tracks. With everything open now, who was to say they weren't out there just waiting for me to step off the train? When I was sure the coast was clear, I made my way through the station as inconspicuously as I could, and headed for the first set of stairs that made themselves known. This was it, my big moment. Just a few more steps to freedom. I never thought I'd be so happy to smell the fresh New York air again. I remember just making it outside, catching that first glimpse of a yellow taxi and a hot dog vendor, before I collapsed to the ground in exhaustion and everything went black again. When I came to, this time I was in a hospital, hooked up to IVs and unsure of what day it was anymore. I had sworn to myself that no one would ever know what had happened to me, but like I said, life had other plans. After the doctors and nurses were sure I was stable, the police were among my first visitors, followed by my parents, my mom sobbing her eyes out. I did my best to work with the authorities, but no one was ever found down there. Nobody even came forward to identify themselves as the ones who helped me in my original scuffle. That was the last time I ever took the subway, and I will never go down there again. On my last day in the hospital, I received an anonymous bouquet of get well flowers, with a card that read, "Perhaps you have found peace after all, young man. Enjoy it while you can. My friends and I will be here waiting for you when you come back." Thank you for visiting me. Please subscribe and smash the like button, this way you will help my channel grow. Take care of you and be careful, there is always something lurking in the shadows.